Hello and welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Kendall Bauer, and today's presentation is Becoming a Birder Part 1, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. Kristina, I'm so happy to be with you today. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Kendall, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm not gonna lie, I feel like I've had this webinar on the back burner for maybe a year in my mind, and I had to brave up and finally do it. So today, everyone, we are going to journey through my fear of birders, which is kind of maybe an embarrassing thing to admit as a guide. And I should say, to be very clear, I don't have a fear of birds themselves. I've been fascinated with them, my whole life since a kid. I have literally had jobs where I was birding. I was doing biodiversity surveys. I'm pretty familiar, I would say, with a lot of the birds in the areas that I've worked. Maybe not some of the more recent places that I've lived, but um, yeah, I mean, they were part of my education, part of my work. But I have never in the last 7 odd years of guiding, nor in my biology career, called myself a birder. And I've had to really think about why that is. And to be honest, I think it's because when you start calling yourself a birder, or the word birder to identify as a birder, in our culture seems to have a lot of connotations that go with it. It seemed like really big boots that I never felt like I was good enough to fill. Um, and I think so to the uninitiated, it does seem really intimidating, this whole, section of interacting with our environment. And, people have their lists and there's these lifetime birds they want to see. There can be a bit of that collectionist mentality, I think, that also maybe is a bit stigmatizing, or just like, I don't know enough, right? There is so many things that you need to, like, there's all this information that you need to be able to take in to be able to, to see that little flash of color, to identify, was it a Tweedledee or was it a Tweedledoo, right? Whether it was, which thrush am I listening to? I think it's sort of this juxtaposition between one of the most accessible ways to interact with your natural world, with your environment, to learn about your habitat, but also one of the most intimidating ones. So hopefully I can do it in a humorous way, but today I want to spend our time breaking down slightly my fear of birders, and through that we can all progress to either being comfortable calling ourselves birders, or at the very least just not being intimidated by it, and starting to work it in to our regular daily lives, whether we're carrying around a lifetime bird list and a pair of binos, or whether we're just, driving a road trip to the next Thanksgiving and you're looking on the power lines as you go and you start to recognize different birds, different features. But I think we're going to do this in a different way, or maybe not in such a different way, but I think approach is so important. So here's how we're not going to teach birding today. We are not going to teach birding in the memorization category. We are not going to teach it with names and numbers, which is how I feel like I was taught genetic biology, or genetics and cellular biology, which, by the way, I did pass, but I passed with a 55 and just barely survived that class. And it wasn't because I didn't think that gene transfer was cool or that how proteins work was interesting. It's just my brain doesn't work like that. I can't just mass memorize things and then hold on to them. I need to understand why is it happening and what is happening. And I might forget, I probably can't tell you the names of any of the proteins that I learned 10 years ago, but I can actually still probably tell you how most cells function and what different roles they have, or what different parts have inside the cell. So I'm hoping that we can teach birding in the same way that I wish someone would have taught me genetics back in the day. And this next piece is maybe just specific to me, but I feel like I should share this because this is actually, to be honest, this is another reason why I've held off on, really fully leaning into birding. And I'm going to use the example because constellations are something I do know really well. And the thing I kind of feared, if I really dove in, if I really wanted to become a birder and to like really understand that, is that I would lose a sense of wonder. And so, brief interlude, but hopefully this is worth everyone's time. So when you're little, or when I was little, I would look up in the night sky and I was amazed, right, at all the stars. You know, today we've got 88 globally accepted constellations that we identify and use for pattern recognition, aka constellations. But when I was little, I didn't know what the constellations were. I knew that there were stories in the sky. And so I was little and I would just connect the dots. I would imagine my own stories and my own shapes. And as I got older, because I was so fascinated with them and I love them so much, I started to learn the constellations. And now I can recognize most of the major ones. I just need to see a few stars and I can piece together, you know, what I'm looking at and things, and, you know, different cultural stories that back up different major stars, or the planets as well, I guess. But it's not the same as when I was little. It's almost like, you know, that imagination side of wonder was traded in for this sense of understanding. And I still find wonder in the stars. I still look up at them and feel awe, but it's also this different kind of awe, right? There's this with the knowing. Once you get rid of the unknown, it kind of changes how you see something. And so I kind of held out birds as my last one of these last things of unknown, where I just appreciate them for what they were. I didn't have to know their name to think they were beautiful, or to think they were amazing, or think how cool they were, you know, feeding their young, or how they, you know, were actually transporting seeds while they were feeding. And, you know, like, I didn't have to know the answers to it. And I think that's a thing about humanity. You know, we're always trying to put things in boxes. And so I'm going to leave an invitation, while we're learning this. We are going to learn their names. We are going to learn how to identify them, and how to structure them. But if you can, do your best to hang on to some of that wonder, some of that stuff, that pull to birds that we're so amazed by them, because it's still there. You're just going to learn it in a different way. So that's my invitation for everyone, as we all take our first baby steps to becoming birds. And I want to start with that wonder. I think that's the best place to start. To, you know, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but to conserve, to understand, or yeah, you need to love something. You're going to conserve, you need to understand it. I've rearranged the order. But that comes down to our base sense of wonder and awe and attachment. And birds really are, they're so beautiful, right? They have been the envy of humanity since our early evolution. And it's because they can fly. I mean, really, we can sum it up to the beauty of it, but really, the envy is the ability to fly. And, you know, we can look at human history, and we have chased them through myth and legend to into the skies themselves. We couldn't grow a pair of wings, so we built them, right? All we wanted to do was be able to fly, to be just like them. And so they're just amazing to watch, because it's still something that we have to, you know, we have to get into a tin box if we want to do, or a squirrel suit if you're braver. But again, that's more falling than flying. But even the most common birds, right? They still hold this kind of eloquence to them, right? That flight, there's something about it, the way that they hold themselves, that we just can't help be drawn to. And when I say even the most common bird, I'm going to say yes, even the most common bird is still beautiful. I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you don't have, well, hopefully you're not afraid of chickens if you're in here. I know some people have been pecked at them, especially when you're little. You always end up with a bit of a phobia. But I would argue even chickens are quite beautiful. And they are our most common bird. Well, they're our most common domesticated bird and most common single species. I don't know if we realize this, but there's about 25 to almost 30 billion birds in the world, right? They've become such a staple food source for pretty much, well, nearly literally every culture. Now, I think an interesting thing when we think about domestication versus birds that are still in their natural environment. So there's, let's say, roughly 27, 28 billion chickens. The next closest, or the next most populous bird that exists out there is actually the red-billed Kila, which is about 1.5 billion. So think about that being the most populous. So the fact that we've got nearly 30 million of these other ones, that's a huge amount of resources. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. But I thought I'd put in some interesting perspective as a quick fun fact. So we're going to jump into the bones of it now, and we're going to try and learn as best we can, how can we identify those birds that we're seeing there. But anytime we go to do something new, this is as much as a reminder for me as it is for everyone else. I always rely on my I was going to say childhood, but truly lifetime hero, Winnie the Pooh. Whenever things seem a bit intimidating, promise me you'll always remember you're braver than you believe, you're stronger than you seem, and you're smarter than you think. So I bet that you know way more about birds already than you even consciously realize. And so, when we look up in the sky, we won't even worry about color, we won't even worry about size just yet. Just think about the shape of their wings. So when you look at all of these birds, and I'll slow down a minute here to give you some time to look through them, I want you to just try and look and see and guess which ones you think are predators. And I also want you to look in there and think which one of these are probably aquatic. Which ones do you think, might dive? Which ones are hunters? So when you're asking yourself that question, you already know little bits and pieces of information. And these are just cartoon silhouettes, right? But I bet that you can start to piece through, there's a few commonalities in there, right? So let's start with our predator friends, right? If we pull the names off and show them, there's a certain shape there, right? In the shape of their wings and the proportion of their body that we're used to seeing. And we might not know which is which, right? You might have mixed up the eagle and the hawk just looking at the rough shape, but you probably had a decent chance of starting to see some commonalities between the two, right? And again, just start with the simple, start with the easy, right? What about some of our water birds, right? Those long, long legs, they're a big difference. And sure, maybe off the first glance when we were looking at them without the names, you didn't know which one was the crane and you didn't know which one was the heron or the stork. But you kind of had an idea that these three would probably be, living a similar life. And, one thing I always really don't like, when you ask someone like, oh, what did you just see? Oh, it was a duck. Well, how did you know it was a duck? Right? Because if all you saw was a brief shadow and you actually look at the difference between ducks and geese, they're actually really quite similar, right? And so, but there are these things these patterns that we've been seeing for a long time. And whether it was watching a cartoon as a kid, or whether it was out in your backyard or at the local wetland, you start seeing things and you start sort of putting in this information together. And so that's what we're going to start from. We're going to start from this bare bones, basic pattern recognition. It's kind of like pulling back the curtain on what is birding and how is it that all these people just instantly know what they're seeing, right? Yes, it comes with training and it comes with time, but we all have those skills to work on pattern recognition. It's all about just training ourselves to piece it together and to think about why is that happening and connecting those dots to what we're seeing. At least I find that if we can do that, it'll stay in our brains a little bit longer than just a list of bird names looking at a sheet. So what we're going to think about and what we're going to focus on is basic anatomy, right? Not anything too crazy, but we can essentially think about how birds, when we look at them, the proportions of their body, how they move, right? Because really, you and I, we're all going to walk or run our way through this world, but birds some of them live on trees, some of them are on the ground, right? Some of them are pecking at it. Some of them are soaring in the ocean for hours and hours, or over the ocean, excuse me, for hours and hours at a time. And so they can have so many different lifestyles. And those lifestyles are reflected in the ratio of how they use their wings versus their legs and their tail to move. And so we're kind of going to work our way through these different ranges of locomotion and the birds that they belong to. So this is less about, species to species. This is about understanding how they function in their environment. And we're going to pick a fun one to start with to kind of ground us, or I guess opposite of ground us. We're going to look at albatross. Specifically, we're going to look at the wandering albatross. So these birds are massive, or I should say, to the very least, that their wingspan is massive. Out of all current living birds, they have the longest wingspan. It's around 3.5 meters long, or about just around 11 feet, which is huge. These are marine birds. They spend hours and hours soaring. Actually, they're such good flyers that they can soar for those hours without even flapping. They can glide. They're so efficient. it's more efficient for them to be in the air than it is for them to be sitting on their nest. They actually burn more calories sitting on the ground than they do because their bodies are so efficient at flying. And so what I want you to look at is the comparison here between the albatross's wings and between a plain wing, right? So if you're going to have these massive, massive outstretched wings, we need to have the support for them. So that's what comes in. If we look at the plane in the bottom, and I think I highlighted it. Yeah, good job. Good job, me. Those are called struts on a plane, right? And so what those are is that you can't have this huge expanse without any support underneath it, right? Triangles, one of our most strongest geometric shapes. And so when our albatross does the full expansion, its arm bones, so its humerus and the extension and its wrist bones are actually underneath acting on that angle to support that really big, massive wing underneath it there. Now, obviously we can't see its bones, but I just want you to get some ideas for when you're seeing different shapes. Those shapes are going to tell you what that bird's lifestyle is like and where it's going to fit into its ecosystem. As a couple kind of cool asides for wandering albatrosses, if you ever are lucky enough to see them, they are that white and gray color, but as they get older, they tend to become more and more white. And they can live up to 50 years, so they can be very, very old, right? So that's kind of a cool thing. You've got these in your area from wherever you're tuning in on. You can kind of start keeping track of, how old are your bird friends? To kind of do the same thing with your neighbors, but apparently it's not as polite to comment on that if you're a human. All right, but let's keep on that. We're going to keep on that thread of thinking about inside. So I'm actually going to teach you how to bird from the inside out, believe it or not. And we're going to start with the skeleton. We're going to start with that structure. And this is a bird you're probably very familiar with, maybe not in this sort of view. This is a pigeon. It's your classic rock pigeon. And as some of you might already be familiar with, bird bones are actually hollow. And there's a lot of misconceptions about these bones. And the first one I want to talk about is that not all of their bones are hollow, which is kind of a cool thing to realize. So for you and I, our bones are filled with marrow, right? And that marrow, all of our bones are filled with marrow. And that marrow is where we create our red blood cells. Super duper important for us being alive, right? Well, birds still need that function, right? So when you look at if you look at our pigeon here and you look at the shaded wings, so you've got let's see if I can do this here, the radius, the ulna, you got your tib fib hanging out here, your scapula, and then they actually have their caudal vertebrae at the end, so their tail. Anywhere that you see it's shaded, that's their bones that are like ours. Those are filling that function, creating new blood cells. Their other bones are hollow. And so if you look at that picture there, it kind of gives you an idea. They're not fully hollow. They still have sort of a similar pattern to ours with all little air bubbles, but their pockets are much, much bigger. And of course, when we first started learning about birds, the initial thought was, oh, that makes sense, right? They have hollow bones so that they can fly, so it makes them lighter. Well, I'm going to tell you that that's actually not quite true. Those hollow bones, so while they have bigger air spaces, bigger gaps, they are actually denser. So, and it kind of makes sense, right? They've got these very thin bones, and in order for them to be strong, imagine that. You got 11 feet of wings that you're powering through when you flap. It's a lot of pressure to have. And so while their bones are thinner and there's less of them, it's actually denser. So if you were to take an animal weight for weight, if you were to take a mouse and a sparrow and look at their bone density, it's more or less the same. It's an equivalent. What we've realized, which I think is maybe arguably as cool or if not more cool, is that it's not just that their bones are hollow, it's that they are pneumatic. So what does that mean? It means that they're attached to their lungs. So those air spaces are not just hollow and void. Those air spaces get filled with air sacs that are connected to their lungs. So as a bird grows, they grow air sacs into them. And so it's actually a capacity to hold more oxygen for them, which again, kind of makes sense. They're going up in the air, less oxygen, so they need to have a greater volume of it in their body if they're going to be able to do that function. Another crazy cool thing, because they can hold air in their bones, which is just wild to say out loud, is that they can actually get oxygen on the inhale and on the exhale. So imagine that if we've got any saxophone players out there, how long a note you could hold on that one, hey? We all just wish we were birds. So it's kind of this amazing superpower that I think we don't really realize. I would also argue a little bit from a sciencey, nerdy perspective is that our bones are filled with fluid. Blood is a fluid. Theirs are filled with air. So even though bone for bone is the same amount of mass density, they still do get an advantage being lighter because theirs are not filled with fluid, which is heavier. They're filled with air. But that's a quick nerdy aside. And to prove my point on how cool this is, so the proportion of a skeleton, how, relatively which bones are filled with air and which ones are filled with marrow is relative. There's a ratio. So the bigger the bird, the more air it has in its bones, or the more hollow bones it has. And as a really sweet example of that is the great blue heron. So blue herons, right? They're a pretty darn big bird if you have the chance to see them in real life. They kind of, would come up to somewhere around your thigh when they're standing up straight, or their shoulder would be a little lower than that, probably on your knee. So if you were to guess the weight of a blue heron, I'm not sure what your initial guesses would be. Mine, I think, I would have guessed it was probably like maybe 10 or 12 pounds. It seems like a pretty big bird, right? No, nope. The average blue heron weighs half that, weighs about 5 or 6 pounds, which is crazy, right? When you're seeing them eat fish, you seem like the fish weighs almost as much as they do, depending on how good their hunting is. And so there's this relationship with the bigger the bird, the more air in their bones, the more hollow their bones. And then there's an inverse relationship. So the more aquatic, or if we have birds that dive, it's actually not an advantage for them to have hollow bones. So that's our penguins, but even ones like auks and murres. If you live by the coast, you might know what I'm talking about. There's some of the awkward little black flappers who seem like they're always struggling, but then they go down, and that's where they're the best at. They have really dense bones, and that makes sense because their lifestyle is different. They're trying to go down deep, so they don't want to float a lot. And also think about you and I getting the bends, right? The less gaseous air you have to manage, right? If you've got air dissolved in your blood, it's not, well, managing the air dissolved in your blood, it can be a tricky one if you've got really big lungs, right? So one quick fact about blue heron just before I walk away from them, because I think it's so funny. So the blue heron, when you look at their feathers at the front, you see how they're all kind of scraggly looking in this picture? This bird is not having a bad day. It's not having a bad feather day. It is completely normal. Those are actually a special type of feather that continually tears and creates this sort of powdery down. And the heron has a special sort of claw on its, or hook on its foot, and it pulls that out and it uses it as a washcloth to clean up all the fish slime and the stickiness. So it's actually quite a proper bird. It's not scraggly. It's holding its own. It's got its own bib, which I just think is so funny. Love it when you realize that everything has a secret purpose, or has had a purpose the whole time. So I didn't want to, yeah. So different example here, right? We think about those penguins. I always think it's interesting when you can see an animal's skeleton versus what we, see on the outside, especially marine animals, because they tend to have a lot of fat. Those look so smooth and sleek. And I would say even the skeleton here is quite smooth and sleek. But I'd also argue that comparative to other bird skeletons, this is almost more dog-like, right? It's kind of a bit more broad in the shoulders. And again, think about propulsion, right? It's using its fins, or it's using its wings more as fins or flippers, right? So you can see that evolution coming into play there along the scapula. And one last thing for our hollow bones before we move on is that it's true for our land birds too. They're still rocking hollow bones. So again, it's not about weight when you think about flying necessarily. For the ostrich, we think that those hollow bones down into the legs are actually a really important part of their cooling system. So that air, when they pant, they're able to get way more heat transpired back and forth. So that bone structure and the placement of those bones is really, well, for lack of a better word, it's the skeleton of how we understand what our bird is going to be and where it's going to fit into the world. So when we're thinking of pattern recognition, we just need things to compare to, really, right? So this one is already labeled pre-hummingbird, but if I just showed you that wing, you'd be like, Kristina, I don't know what bird that is. How could I ever tell? But if we start having comparisons, then our brains can start doing patterns, right? So if we can bring those two together, And then if we can tie it into what we understand of their life cycle, this makes a lot of sense, right? Our hummingbirds are very small, petite, and those wings need to go very, very fast, whereas our pigeons are a bit more of those awkward flapper flyers, sort of short bursts of energy as they take off, right? It's a different lifestyle. So let's start with that. We don't have to worry about color. We don't have to worry about, did it have a dash under its eye? Let's just start very simply with shape. And we'll start with the big boys because that's raptors are always fun. Let's be honest. Right. So let's think about this. These are some of our big raptor groups. And when you look up in the sky, it's nice if you can see the bald or the white head of the bald eagle. There's a nice giveaway. But what about if you're looking at a juvenile golden eagle? So they haven't quite fully grown into their size yet. They're full brown. And you're trying to tell, is that an eagle or is that a hawk? What am I looking at, right? Well, when we look at our eagles, or even if you think about looking up and you're squinting into the sunlight and you're trying to see, there's a few really, kind of giveaways or shape patterns that you can start looking for to really tease that apart for yourself. So the first one that's kind of fun to think about is that those primate feathers, those flight feathers for eagles, they're like fingers. That's why those are those beautiful feathers, when you're so lucky to find one that's fallen. Lots of cultures that's a rite of passage that is part of growing up because they are these big, beautiful, magnificent feathers. And when you see them flying, they're very spread out. The sunlight will go between them, right? So those are clear feathered fingers. And also when we think about the shape of our eagles, they're going to be box shaped or rectangular, right? They're not long and elegant. They're taking up that space. Now, our next two there, buteo and accipiter. So those two, you're like, Kristina, I don't know what that is. Well, it's okay. Those are just hawks. Don't overstress it. We're going to talk about their names in just a second. Actually, we'll jump back and we'll do this first. So those both belong to depending on where you're from, this is something I didn't realize until doing this. Where I grew up, we would call these hawks. That would be the overall group. And then, is it a goshawk? Is it a red-tailed hawk? Is it Swainson's hawk? Those are, those are things we would start picking apart. But apparently, if you're from other parts of the world, you might be calling this a buzzard, which is a bit confusing to me because I always thought about buzzards as vultures. But I guess that, words transition in meaning depending on where you're from. So for me, these would be the two primary groups of hawks. And their body shape is indicative of how they live, right? So the buteo, right, it's kind of got a bit more rectangular shape, kind of like the eagle, but it has less defined, sharper fingers. And the tail isn't, it's closer tucked into the body. And that is reflective of the way that they live, right? So these ones are soaring, they're sort of catching thermals, but they've got a bit more maneuverability they have a little bit less maneuverability than our second type of hawk, which is the accipiter. So they've got that longer tail, so they can make those really flashy, quick turns. And they're, those are going to be going in smaller spaces. So when you think about a hawk that can sort of weave in and out of trees, you're more likely looking at a accipiter hawk. If you're looking at one out in the prairies and it's soaring up above and it's doing slow, wide turns, you're going to be looking at the buteo. And we'll break those down into more specifics in a second. I'll just go back for the falcon here. And then lastly, our little falcon friend. So their wings look more like boomerangs, right? So we lose that long arc, and now it's more, what am I trying to say here? Convex, coming around the head. And these are our little speed demons, for lack of a better word, right? These are the ones that can whip in and out of places, some of our fastest birds in the world, right? Those are going to be our falcons. So let's do our first test. Let's see how we're doing. So the 4 pictures on the left, it's all one of these. It's either an eagle, a buteo, a accipiter, or a falcon. And so let's use some of the evidence that we've kind of built up to break it together. And the idea is just, right, they're not always going to be holding perfectly still for you. They're going to be at these different angles that will dictate it, right? So if we look at the tail, well, it's kind of more of a fan-shaped tail, relatively short of the body. and it doesn't have those boomerang wings, so it's probably not a falcon. And then if we look at the next one from the bottom, the accipiter, right, the tail not quite as long, a little closer to the body. So it's either an eagle or it's a buteo, right? So we can kind of narrow that down. And I would say the last clue I would look for is I would look for those feathers, for those fingers, right? And those are, it's kind of tricky, right? If you look in the top right photo, you might think, yeah, those kind of look like eagle feathers. You can see light between them. But if you look at it banking and different angles, you can see, oh no, they're pretty close together, right? So I would put that into the buteo category. And in fact, what we're looking at is a red-tailed hawk. So red-tailed hawks are arguably the most common raptor in North America that you will have a chance to see. For myself, I grew up on the prairies, right? So those are the ones you'd see sitting on the power poles, waiting for a snack to go by. And thankfully for the name, it helps with the identification, right? So in their adult color morph, they do tend to get red on their tail. As with everything, there are always a few subspecies exceptions, but we're not here to learn about exceptions just yet. We're here to learn about the general rules. And I would argue that the most fun fact about red-tailed hawks is something that they never chose for themselves. So whenever you're watching TV and there's the big majestic scene and you see the big beautiful lake and the eagle swoops in and there's this big sort of sorrowful cry that the eagle makes as it swoops over, that's not an eagle. That at some point Hollywood thought that the sound that an eagle makes is not nearly impressive enough, and so most audio clips, and because also we've been trained for this now for so long, most of those cries that you hear are almost always a red-tailed hawk. So if you ever want to petition Hollywood for something, you should tell them that we need to acknowledge that that's not what an eagle sounds like, and that we can give the voice back to a red-tailed hawk. So that's my what am I trying to say? My protest request for today. But yeah, I just want to give you an idea that it just does take some basic shapes to start filling in which birds you think you're looking at. And then you can start narrowing it down more, right? So these are those general groups. And then we can think about what birds we would find inside of them, right? So with falcons, you might be looking for kestrels, merlins, a peregrine falcon, accipiters. Those are our Cooper's hawk, goshawks, right? We're looking for that longer tail again. And so don't stress too much about the names just yet, but that's how you're going to want to start looking for groups, right? Start learning those patterns, and it doesn't take too much. You'll start to, I would say lots of you have already seen all of these things, but you didn't have the words for it. I think that's kind of one of the gifts of when you start to learn birding. It's a big vocabulary, but it gives you words for things you already know. I don't think anything I'll teach folks today, besides the Hollywood fact or a few others, is going to be too far out there, but it's just giving you the language or sort of the tools in your head to start putting together the things that you already see and the things that you already know. So we've looked at what wings belong to which birds. Now I have to start thinking about, well, why do I have those wings versus other wings, right? So our long, narrow wings, those are our gliders. That short, broad one, that's a very stereotypical eagle, hawk, right? Or sorry, that's the long and broad. Short and broad is going to be our hawks and our owls. Our speedmeisters, right? The ones that are doing our dips and dives, and that includes falcons and even sparrows, right? Things like that. They have some of that same structure. So don't get overwhelmed, but this is essentially how we can, if we want to think about grouping birds, we can learn all of their names, 100%, and we will over time. Remember, this is part one. Stick with me, and we're gonna keep learning names. But what I want us to focus on this first initial level is I want to focus on function. So who soars over the ocean? Who soars over land? Who does short burst flying? And who are some of our divers and some of our swimmers? Because if you can learn to just recognize their wings, you will already know, without context, you can just see one sitting on a rock and be like, oh, that's probably this bird. Or again, there's a lot of information that goes with birding, which is part of the fun. It's kind of like a big game of Clue of was it Colonel Mustard in the library or not? So again, in order for us to have some common language about this, so that we can talk about it. I know that birds invented flying first, but I'm going to borrow some words from aviation so that we can all understand what I'm talking about when we're looking at that quadrant of which birds belong to which group. So maybe I'll pop back for just a second. So if you look at this, the quadrant was broken into two things. Do they have their wing loading and their aspect ratio? So we're going to talk about aspect ratio first. What in the world does that mean? Well, when we're talking about flying, aspect ratio is how long are your wings versus how wide are your wings. And it's not exactly quite width. When you do chord length on a plane, so if you do here, right, because a plane has a curved thing on it. So width is from point to point, but chord length actually follows a curve, just like most bird wings, right? Bird wings aren't straight. So that's the halfway center along a curve. It's how long is that? So aspect ratio is, do you have really long, narrow wings will give you a high aspect ratio, and really short, blunt wings will give you a low aspect ratio. And there's pros and cons to each of these. High aspect ratios, they have less drag, so they're more efficient, takes less energy. Go back to our albatross with its massive, massive wings, right? That makes sense. Low aspect, think of our squat little pigeon trying to fly, right? Less efficient, but it's trying to do different things. It's trying to eat all of the grain that someone threw down in the marketplace. And so those are pros and cons depending on what lifestyle you're trying to lead. Second one, wing loading, has to do with the surface area of your body versus how heavy you are. And I like to think of this as, are you a flying squirrel or are you a falling squirrel? So in the bottom right corner, right, you can either be quite small and dense, or you can be really big and open and have the same weight, which means that you have more resistance. That's what our flying squirrel is taking advantage of, right? So our flying squirrel has a low wing load, right? Doesn't have a whole lot of energy. The wings are holding less weight per area, versus a falling squirrel has a high wing load and she's going down. Not a good time to be a falling squirrel. Everyone would rather be a flying squirrel. Well, human-wise, I would rather be a flying squirrel. But birds have found different solutions. So we're going to use that to remember. Are you a flying squirrel? Are you a falling squirrel? That's your surface area. And what are your wings like? Right, so let's think about those marine soarers first. And we'll go back to our albatross because we're kind of familiar with them already, right? So they need to be able to fly for long periods of time over the ocean. There are not a lot of places to land. Actually, let's back that statement up. There are not a lot of places to take off from. An albatross sure could land you anywhere in the ocean, but when you have wings that big, it is hard to get up and off the ground. And that's the trade-off, is that they are very, very efficient up, soaring, gliding in the sky, but they lose that. They lose the advantage when they're close to ground. They need a lot of energy to take off, or they need really high winds to help them take off. So when they're flying, they're taking advantage of things that you and I can't see, or at least we can't see directly, because they are gliding. But gliding, if we think about our flying squirrel, is really just like fancy falling, unless you can find something to pick you back up. Let me introduce you to thermals. Aerothermals are super cool. They're happening all the time around us. We just can't see them. But our world doesn't heat up the same way in the same places. And so anytime you look up in the sky and you're looking way up and you can see those big, beautiful arcs that, you know, your vulture is making, or the eagle, or for our marine soarers, our albatross friends, sometimes even pelicans going up, they're taking advantage of rising hot air. So the location can vary. Sometimes it's just a change from land to water. Sometimes you can have orographic, we call it orographic uplift is the fancy word, but basically you have a hill in the way, and so the hill forces the air up. But the important thing that happens is that air gets pushed up, and it's slightly warmer than the surrounding air. So hot air rises, usually about 1 or 2 degrees warmer, and that's enough. It doesn't take very much. That 1 or 2 degrees warmer is enough for that air to be moving 2 or 3 meters per second faster than the air around it. And so those birds, the way that they're so efficient at flying is that they're not using any of their own energy to lift themselves up. They're riding it up in those big, slow circles, and then they'll glide down, and they're trying to catch the next thermal nearby. And you might ask, how do they know where to go? Well, for some of them, they're reading the landscape just like you and I would. But a fun one is sometimes it's just social cues. Sometimes they see another bird circling and they're like, oh, sweet, there's the next thermal I'm going to jump to. So even though it might seem like they're roaming up there alone, they actually are looking out for each other. Um, Probably one of the coolest examples of this is our frigates. We have the Great Frigate and the Magnificent Frigate. In North America, I think the only one we would get eyes on would be the Magnificent Frigate down in Florida. And yes, I will say frigate as many times as I can because I think it's hilarious. The word comes from the French. It's the translation from it's a oh my gosh, I'm losing my word. Anglicized version of the word that they use for fast warship. Frigate, la frégate. And these birds are amazing soarers. They are like that because they're also not very good at landing, just like our albatross friend. So what they do is they do a lot of shallow dives and they catch fish at the surface. They've also been called kleptoparasites, which is a fancy word for bird thieves. Because they're not very good at landing, they will often harass other birds to get them to drop their food and then take it from them. So not everybody loves a good frigate, depending on where you're from. But these birds, so let's say usually their range is they're hanging out, within 60 meters or a couple hundred meters, but they've been known to go up to 4,000 meters in cumulus clouds. So that's 4 kilometers in the air, catching a ride up. And when they're that high, they can glide for 60 kilometers down. And so what they're doing is they're following the trade winds down along the equator. They catch these big cloud rides up. Then they look down, when they see a bunch of tuna chasing a school of fish or dolphins, then they come down, steal the meal out from in front of them, and then circle back up and do it again. These are, again, birds that can be in the air for hours, which is unbelievable, in my opinion. So if only to be a frigate, hey? All right. Well, I'll leave the frigates alone, I promise. So we're going to switch over. We're going to switch over to our aquatic friends. So we're going to use cormorants as an example. And when we're talking about a cormorant's body, so they want to be able to dive and get a ways down there, right? And so their efficiency in flying or their focus on their wings is different. They have a high aspect ratio. So that means they've got nice long wings, but they are falling squirrels, not flying squirrels. That means that they have the mass of their body relative to the surface area is not so good. It's pretty tight. Again, they have different goals though, right? They're trying to dive down. They want that density for the advantage of that. One of the consequences of this life choice though is that relative to other birds, they have limited maneuverability. And so when they land, they can be a little awkward. And so here's an example of I'm going to say for sure photographer, probably birder. This is from a fellow named Ron Dudley. And again, birders notice things in great detail. And so he took 2 pictures. He shared a story of this is a double-crested cormorant. And he had a query for his internet companions. He said, why is it that when a cormorant lands, it looks like it just kind of like plunges in versus something like the American pelican, which almost like water skis gracefully, right? And so again, this comes back to how they fit in on their wing structure. So our cormorants versus our pelicans, our cormorants are not great. They don't have the maneuverability and they don't have the grace of our pelican because of where their wings are and where their center of gravity is. So if you think about you and I when we stand up, right? Even male to female center of gravity is different. But back in the day, the dinosaurs, they had their balance on their back legs. And as birds evolved, their balance went more forward. So for our cormorant, their center of mass is actually ahead of them. And so if their feet, they would actually plunge right over. So they have to kind of like almost like backpedal themselves in or really dig in, I guess part of why I wanted to bring this up is that birds are not always graceful, right? Or, what's graceful in one scenario is not graceful in another. Cormorants, beautiful divers. You watch them land on a pond or you watch sometimes some different geese take off. You're just like, buddy, you barely made it out of the water there on that one. But again, Everyone's got different skills in different areas. Okay, let's keep going. Let's talk about some aerial hunters. We haven't talked about any little birds yet. I'm actually a big fan of cliff swallows. I mean, when we were little, they're always building nests on the edge of our roof. My mom and dad didn't like it. But as birds themselves, I thought they were pretty amazing and pretty beautiful. So they're smaller, but these ones, when we go back to what their wing structure is like, so they've got high aspect, so it means that they've got relatively longer, narrow wings, and their surface area to their body size is pretty good. So they're able to maneuver quite well. And this includes things like swallows, martins, swifts, nightjars. They would all fit into this category. Which again, if you don't know any of those words that I just said, that's okay. That's why we're going to learn this piece by piece. We're just getting some fundamentals in place. And of course, our eagles, right? If we go back and think about them, we've talked about the shape of their wings a couple times now. But even though, they are quite big and graceful, they actually have low aspect wings. So that means that they're able to turn and manipulate more, which makes sense, right? They're hunters. They want to be able to get at their prey. So they don't want to soar, they don't have, well, they do soar quite well, but let's compare them to someone like the frigate or the albatross that's doing these big, long gliding journeys. They want to be able to maneuver quickly. They still, have their nests in trees, depending on where you're living at. Some of them are fishing, some of them are even hunting antelope, right? So the ability to bank that smaller, brunter wing, or proportionally brunter, how am I losing my words right now? Anyways, that shorter wing relative to their body size is the reason for that. But again, they've still got really big wings relative to their body, and so that's where they balance it out. And we're forgetting some of our maybe more, I'm going to say our more food-related birds, potentially. If anyone knows Chicken, Alaska, it was named after the ptarmigan because no one could decide on or remember how to spell where the silent P went in the ptarmigan. So these birds, right, these are short taker-offer birds. They don't generally travel long distances. Ptarmigan are one of the ones that don't migrate out of the Arctic when they go. And so these would go into our falling squirrel category, right? Their wing size relative to their body is not super great, so they don't have the advantage there. But they can bank fairly well. A fun fact about these guys is that when they go to sleep at night in the wintertime, they will line up on a snowbank, and the whole flock will just fly straight to the snowbank and go poof right into it. Sometimes they'll sleep in the trees as well, but they do that to get the insulation because otherwise their little bodies, they would freeze at night. So that's their extra little insulation. If they're not careful, it also makes them a real easy snack for an Arctic fox, though. So you got to balance your life choices. And lastly, our most special and quite unique ones is our hoverers. So they're the only true bird that hovers is the hummingbird. There are ones that can do fairly close to it. And interestingly enough, it's not maybe the relationship you would think. So they have high aspect wings, so they've got relatively long, narrow wings, but they actually have a really high wing loading, which means that their bodies are quite heavy relative to their wings, right? So it's like being our helicopter that has to continually be in motion in order for them to stay in the air. And so when you think about their wing stroke, it's really high energy, right? They pretty much, if they're awake, they need to be eating because they're consuming so much. But one thing that we don't often think about is that one thing that's unique about their wing stroke is that they can create lift. So, you flap your hands through the air, they're pushing that air down. They can do that on the upstroke and the downstroke. And so what that means is that their shoulders, they actually turn in a pattern. This might be easier to see it. Their wings create a figure 8 stroke, which is pretty amazing. And it's the reason why they have it's the reason they can have such an impressive hover. Just about we're doing good on time. And so with that hover, last thing I wanted to show everyone, just because it's a fun one to end on, is that, so for a hummingbird, if you think about the amount of energy it takes to keep that figure 8 pattern going and smoothness, and then to be able to steer their very long beak into these exact places in order to get the nectar from a flower, what they're doing is they actually use their tail, right? So that's what they use to create drag and break, is one way to think about it. So this picture here, you can see the tail bends forward. So the wings flap forward and then the tail pushes back so that they can then stay in place and they arc. Yeah, you can kind of see there, they arc their back to be able to stay in that one spot long enough to feed before they move on, really just a few seconds later. So that does bring us to nearly a close here. And I hope that sort of what some folks have learned today is that it's not about names in a book, right? I think it's really important to be driven by how does something work and why does it work that way? Because if we think about the hows and the whys, then we can start thinking about how interactions work. And I think that, really has a lot more meaning. That builds story into our lives and into their lives. I've intentionally kept things, let's say, to the basics this time, because I want you to be able to go out and start looking for patterns that we talked about today, patterns that you're already noticing. And those patterns are going to have names as we move through the webinar series, and we'll start to look at different groups in more detail and, dig into some of the more beautiful, more colorful, some of the interesting hunters out there. But my hope for all of you today is to not get overwhelmed. Birding is such a good time. Even if all you do is use it to take 5 minutes to just breathe outside, that is already a success. Hopefully you still see some birds. But it's about, incorporating that into your behavior. And I will pause there and pass it back to Kendall if there's any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristina. That was such a great introduction. And looks like we only have one question so far, but we had a lot of comments about people who've learned a lot today. They were very happy to be here. So the one question we have right now is about kestrels. Kestrels can hover for short periods looking down for prey. Are they the only raptors that can do that?
To my knowledge, yes. So yeah, there are a few birds that can do temporary hovers, but it's not the true hummingbird hover. I'm trying to think really quickly here. Maybe kites, but I'm going to say I don't think so. To my knowledge, I'm going to say just the kestrel.
Okay.
But I will check before our next one.
Great. Yeah. My question for you is if someone wants to get started, let's say this week, before your next presentation on part 2, what kind of gear do you recommend? Do you have any books, or maybe what kind of binoculars can people start to stock up on?
Yeah, I kind of purposely avoided that, Kendall, but I will happily. So gear.
Sorry.
There's 2 reasons why. No, it's okay. It's okay, because I think that's the one thing that intimidates people. I know the very first time I opened up a birding book, I'm like, how am I supposed to know what to do with this? A lot of people's favorites is Sibley's Guide. There's a reason why it's a house name. You can get it for your area. I think Sibley's has an app as well. I would say the preferred app is probably Merlin, and I might even do a whole webinar on Merlin a little later on, just to break down how to use it and how to get the most out of it. So as far as sort of resources wise, there are lots of local birding ones too, which are, one, it's nice to support sort of local publishers, but 2, you're going to get it narrowed down to like, here's your most 20 common birds, right? For wherever your region is, which can be nice, because those big regional books can be, again, intimidating. So wherever you're from, it's worth to look for those. And then binocular wise, yeah, you don't want to start off with your big powerful ones. You want to actually be able to kind of, because especially when you're looking for little birds in the trees. I'm trying to think what mine are. Are they 30s? It's not terrible. I can't even remember what mine are at. But yeah, pretty much I would say if you're starting, just get yourself a cheap pair. Go to your whatever your local hunting store is or whichever. Because the other thing is that birding is as much sight as sound, and I think that's one of the ones, like trading wise, that takes a bit more time. But yeah, I think the big one is like try and pick. You can start with the book by all means, but I would even say most people have smartphones now. You can even do the inverse of like just try and pick one thing that you've seen a day, and think about where you live. If they're migrating times, we're kind of through most of that now. I've got a friend, she's trying to work her way through plants. So she's trying to learn one plant a day, which is actually quite a lot, right? But if you can do one bird a day, even if it's not one that you see that day, open up a book and learn one. Then the next time you see it in the fall when it comes back, there'll be a little nugget of information that you have to hold on to it. So maybe that's my suggestion. If you're either Google a fun bird or try to look up one bird a day for a week that's my challenge for everybody.
That's such a great approach. Yeah, really great advice. We had a couple of people say a webinar on Merlin would be fantastic. So something to keep in mind. I think our next webinar with you is in about a month. So I think that's when we can look for part 2, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna pretty much just do birding for the next while. So I think mine are a little hodgepodge just with over the summer, but folks, yes, we're gonna have a whole stream of birding exercise. I've got a bunch of fun ones planned. We're gonna do investigate a murder with crows. We're gonna or some of the other ones I thought about. We're gonna look at some different flock structures. I got a few fun ideas kicking around already.
That's great. I'm so excited. I'm looking forward to that. As I told you before the webinar, I'm starting to get into birds, so this is very exciting for me. All right, well, I'm going to
Perfect.
call it there, Kristina, and hand it back over to you for any closing comments you want to make.
Yeah, just thank you everyone. Thank you for taking a deep breath and maybe stepping into something that felt intimidating or that felt like it was beyond you. Um, you know, I don't think nature should feel inaccessible to anyone. I think that's one thing we should all work together towards in any little piece of way possible. Because that's just something in our heads, right? It's either something we've been told or something that we tell ourselves. So the best thing we do is just shake that off and go outside and go look for some birds. Go be a part of nature because you already are.
Absolutely. They're right outside our window right now. So go out and enjoy, everyone. Well, thank you so much, Kristina, for this. This was fascinating as always. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out the rest of the week's lineup, including registration links and replay links for our previous webinars on our website at nethab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation. We'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.